Hello and welcome to Autistic FM. My name is Haje. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm your host on this journey. You can subscribe to Autistic FM wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find the transcripts and additional information about each episode on autistic.fm. In this episode, I'm joined by Serena Poganski, a board-certified behavior analyst, or a BCBA. She's also a late-diagnosed autistic individual, navigating her life as a neurodivergent mother, professional, and advocate. She shares her journey from suspecting her neurodivergence to receiving a formal autism diagnosis, a discovery that transformed her understanding of herself and her approach to life. Our conversation delves into Serena's work in modern ABA, or applied behavior analysis, addressing the controversies surrounding the practice and exploring how ethical neurodiversity-affirming approaches can support autistic individuals in thriving on their own terms. Now, I do want to acknowledge that ABA is a highly controversial topic within the autistic community. And this episode does offer one perspective, but it won't be the last time that we explore ABA on this podcast. Future episodes will feature a range of voices and viewpoints to provide a broader understanding of the complexities surrounding this topic. I'd love to hear any suggestions if you know of guests who would be a great fit for the podcast to talk more about ABA. As usual, a quick trigger warning. This episode does include discussions about meltdowns, sensory overloads, emotional regulations, and yes, ABA. All of these things may be sensitive topics for some listeners. Please do take care of yourself and listen accordingly. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's roll the tape. Hello, dear guest. Thank you for being on the podcast. Can we start with your name and your pronouns, please?
Yes, my name is Serena Poganski and pronouns are she, her.
Awesome. And where in the world are you?
I am in Pennsylvania, United States.
Awesome. I am on the other side of the country in Oakland, California. I am super curious. Are you neurodivergent yourself?
Yes, I am. Yes.
How did you discover that?
I have suspected that I may be on the spectrum for many, many years, but just almost lightheartedly, it was almost like a running joke in my head that like have these autistic tendencies, and then I let it go, and I didn't explore it more until later on in life. I think I just didn't see myself fitting into the diagnostic criteria at the time, especially because I only had like more of that stereotypical view of what autism was, and obviously I ended up in a career that's in the field and I learned a lot more. But I would say it wasn't until shortly after I had my first child that I really started looking into it and thinking, is this something that I should check into? Because when you have a kid, your world kind of flips upside down. And I went from living in this very like quiet, controlled, routine lifestyle, I feel like. And
what I'm hearing is that kids maybe aren't that quiet, controlled, or routine.
No, not at all. So, yeah, I kind of went into a state of burnout shortly, around that time, and I didn't realize why I was having such a hard time handling all the change. And all of my autistic traits kind of amplified, like things that I've had all my life just sort of amplified. I could no longer handle sounds and, all the sensory things. And then a year into having my son, he started showing some autistic tendencies too. And then I was like, this could really be something. And I went down the rabbit hole. I saw I started delving into like the autism community online, and I was able to see representations that looked a little bit more and felt more like me. And so I did a ton of research for about a year. And then I'm just the kind of person that really wanted that like professional outside validation. I wanted to know. And so I did end up seeking out a formal diagnosis, and that was that.
Yeah. How long was that ago?
That was was about 2 years ago, I believe. Yeah.
Did anything change for you with the diagnosis?
Yeah, definitely. Mostly just a sense of it was such a freeing thing, honestly. The way that it came for me. Um, I would say just a sense of validation and understanding, um, and a better way to describe some of my struggles. And I think just being aware made me better able to learn to accommodate and handle them. And then I ended up having another baby, and the second time around, I was able to accommodate for myself, um, and notice when I was feeling a little burned out or when the noise was too much, and just take better care of myself. So
Yeah, that sounds pretty intense.
yeah, yeah, it was. It was a journey. I feel like I spent the first year just trying to figure out if that fit me, and now I'm spending like this past year working on unmasking and things like that, and that's a whole other journey too.
Yeah. So you mentioned some sensory overwhelm. How does autism show up for you? Like, what is uh your shape of the spectrum, shall we say?
Yeah. I've always had a tough time with in sensory aspect, uh noise, and it's not necessarily volume of noise, but overlap of noise, and just different things going on in my environment at the same time. So I have a lot of trouble filtering those things out, which makes it tough, especially with kids around. Always making noise, and then say I'm trying to have a conversation with someone in front of me, I have to really focus on filtering everything out and all of those other things. I'm a high masking autistic as well, so it comes with that. And then just I think one of the biggest ways that autism affects me too is just my resistance to change. I'm a very routine person. I have some
Yeah.
difficulty being outside of my familiar environment. So,
No,
um,
I get that 100%. You mentioned that professionally you're involved with autism in some aspect. Could you say a little bit more about that?
yeah, yeah. So, um, in college, I ended up pursuing the psychology route. I thought I was going to become a therapist. And then I kind of landed somewhere else. And right now I'm a board certified behavior analyst, at BCBA, which means that I work on ABA therapy, with primarily children with autism diagnoses.
In the autism community, I don't think you can say ABA and have people not have a strong feeling about it, right? And I'm curious, what do you actually do? I'm really curious about what modern ABA looks like. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. First, I feel like I have to acknowledge that, yes, it is a very controversial topic within the community. And I also want to say that, um, I don't disregard or not believe anyone's, lived experiences, because the truth is that our history is dark. And we have come a long way. And it's not to say that every practitioner or ABA agency out there is doing everything ethically. But I do think it's also important to acknowledge the changes that have come about. So, um, what ABA is essentially like the science of behavior and how we learn and how we build habits and break old ones. And what we do is step in and look at a child's, or whoever we're working with, the individual's strengths and weaknesses. We'll look at specific behaviors of concern, from the family. But what we're focusing on in ABA, the way that I practice, is always on skills that will better the individual's life, help them to become more independent, help them to be able to communicate better, even advocate better. Um, and I know in the past, like a lot of the concern with ABA was that, like, oh, we're training children to appear neurotypical, and stopping them from stimming and forcing eye contact and things like this, which is very concerning, and it was, and I'm sure is a reality in some practices. Uh, but I consider myself a neurodiversity affirming BCBA. Um, and those are things that I think are rapidly decreasing and changing. Um, and we're looking at more ethical ABA, looking at allowing the child to, again, like I said, be more independent and thrive, uh, while still being their autistic self is sort of how I would view the way that I practice.
And I think just to kind of touch on the old kind of Lövås approach to ABA seemed to be mostly to make the kids as unannoying as possible, basically, right?
Yeah,
Which is,
yeah.
and the important difference there to me, as far as I understand, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, the
Hmm.
difference is, are we doing this for the child or are we doing this for the grown-ups? And I think
Definitely.
the nuance I'm hearing in what you're saying is like, hey, if a child's stim is to bump their head against a wall, maybe you can encourage them to do something that is less harmful. Like
Yeah.
that still is a stim, but it is less harmful. Am I hearing that right? Is that more the kind
Mm.
of direction you're going?
Yeah, exactly. So we would look at the whys behind these behaviors and essentially try to replace like stims that are harmful, or, maybe communication that's not like done in the best way. So maybe we're replacing like, oh, this child is like aggressing on a peer to get access to an item because they don't have a better way to communicate. That's what's worked for them. We're still going to focus on getting that same need met, whether it be, access to an item, teaching them how to communicate in whatever way works for them. So that could be vocal, sign, teaching them to use a device. So getting that need met, or even when it's a sensory need, exactly like what you said, sort of trying to replace stims with stims that are less harmful. So it's always looking at like any behavior that we're decreasing, we're usually adding in a replacement, so that that need is still getting met.
Um, so what I'm hearing you say is that you're working with people to kind of retrain behaviors. And one of the things you mentioned was like getting attention or getting access. So instead of running up to me and hitting me with a stick, which will definitely get my attention, but is maybe not helpful in terms of learning communication, you try and replace that in some way. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, exactly. Um, so yeah, like what you said, hitting you with a stick would probably get your attention and would be effective and would strengthen the behavior in the future. So we always say that by turning around and providing that attention, that's sort of serving as just the natural reinforcement that would cause that behavior to strengthen and continue. So we would replace that with maybe a tap on the shoulder, or, words if they have words, or a sign, and then start really highly responding to that one rather than the aggression, so that that behavior becomes the strong one and the other one sort of falls off.
But this sounds to me like a lot more carrot than stick. Am I hearing that right? Because I feel like one of the original concerns about ABA was a very kind of punishment led, hey, don't do the thing. But it sounds
Uh,
like you're actually, instead of doing the don't do the thing, you're like, hey, here's a thing to do instead kind of thing.
yeah, definitely. I know there was a lot of punishment, like punishment procedures used in the past. But at this point, we know that reinforcement typically is way more effective in long term in changing behavior, and it's also less harmful.
What
Yeah.
draws you to this work?
Um. Hmm. Like I said, I sort of fell into it, so I ended up doing an internship in college that involved working with kids with some elements of ABA in it. Um, And I realized that I just really enjoyed the combination of being able to be personable and connect with these kids and like work with human beings in ways that will affect their lives forever, even teaching those basic skills that they'll use forever, like toileting and self-care skills and things like that we also do. So that aspect of it combined too with the science of it, we use evidence-based procedures. We collect data so that we can really see in real time, is what we're doing working? And if it's not, then we know to tweak it and to try something different. So I like the combination of personal work, connecting with the kids, and then also the data behind it and the science of how our brains work and how we pick up new things.
You mentioned that at least one of your kids is neurodivergent. Are they both spectrumy?
The number two is only 3 months old, so
Okay,
we
so
shall see.
unclear.
Yeah, yeah.
Fair enough. And how old is the oldest?
He will be 3 very soon. Yeah.
Okay. And so are you using do you practice what you preach, I guess? Are you helping him find his ways
I
with the techniques you've learned?
I think I sort of naturally have used some of the things that I've just learned through my career in raising him. Just simple things like knowing that with autism we crave routine. We like to know what's coming next. So I've always, since the very beginning, sort of given him those like, okay, in 5 minutes, this is what we're gonna do, and we're gonna move to this, and then so sort of priming him for what's to come to kind of set him up for success. And I think that has helped. Um, and just, yeah, I think I've naturally sort of sprinkled in a little bit of what I know in the way that I raised him, but it's also been also humbling, being a parent after being in this career.
So you found yourself in this career before you had a diagnosis yourself, before you had kids yourself. Do you
Hmm.
feel like you kind of joke that some part of you always knew, but do you feel like that was kind of what drew you in that direction, or is this a complete coincidence?
Yeah, I always find it so interesting that I ended up like working with the autistic population and then later in life find this out. Um, I don't know. I feel like honestly it wasn't a thought until maybe around the time that I started delving into the field. Um, and although a lot of the kids that I work with present very differently than I do, I think there was sort of a sense of connection at times. Like I've always felt very comfortable and connected with the kids that I've worked with. So I think it was there a little bit. And then I do remember a time specifically when I worked with an older, she was a 16-year-old, um, and she was more of a low support needs autistic. And I remember being at her home working with her and watching her interaction with like between her and her mother and thinking, this reminds me so much of myself as a teenager. And so that was one of those moments where I was like, it's
Wait
interesting.
a minute. Yeah, that's,
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of wonderful though. I mean, to find moments of self-reflection and self-insight that way, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned that this one person you were working with was relatively low support needs. Is there like a balance for the people you tend to work with? Does it tend to be more higher support needs kids?
I would say so. Yeah. The majority of the kids that I've worked with are higher support needs, but I get a mix. And I think, another part of that is being able to uh pick up on the fact that they are neurodivergent too. Because the older individual that I mentioned, um, who knows? Like, she could have ended up same as me, just undiagnosed. And as
She
we learn
becomes a
more,
psychiatrist, works with kids, and then realizes,
yeah,
yeah,
right, right. But because we're learning so much more about autism and the diagnostic process, I think that it just like the increase we talked about, the increase in diagnosis, and I think that that is, in my opinion, largely because we're just getting better at diagnosing. Um,
yeah.
yeah,
I'm noticing a little bit of envy right now, actually, when like I haven't been formally diagnosed. I'm 43 years old, but I've known for the last couple of years. And at this
yeah,
point, I'm like, yeah, I'm autistic. I'm not even, there's literally no doubt in my mind at this point.
yeah, yeah.
But the curiosity I have is like, I wish. So the combination for me of alexithymia, so not being able to kind of identify my emotions
Mm-hmm.
and then needing to kind of self-regulate, but not knowing necessarily what is happening in my body. Like, I wish I could get some coaching. Like, there's like this, like, how do you self-regulate? How do you down-regulate? How do you, and so hearing you work with a 16-year-old is like, I wish somebody at 16 would have sat me down and was like, hey, here's how you
Mhm.
down-regulate yourself. I would have been like, yes, please. Why isn't this shit taught? It's crazy.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I feel the same way. Because I mean, I largely struggle with emotional regulation. And I remember especially in those teen years having a very hard time regulating. Um, and that's something I'm working on right now, still today. Uh, but yeah, I think it's tricky. It's tricky because for those of us with lower support needs, it does get missed a lot. And then it's kind of a recipe for burnout in the future.
Do you
I
have any
think,
tips? Like what, or do, like, what do you do to make sure you're well-regulated?
um, like I said, this is something that I'm still sort of working on because I just discovered my neurodivergence within the past couple of years. So I think, like you said, it's tough because before I would push myself to a degree that like it just was harmful, you know. And now that I know, I can sort of stop myself before I'm at the point of like, oh, I'm on the verge of a meltdown. I guess I'll try to talk a little bit from like a behavior analytic perspective
Yeah,
of some
please.
things that I've tried that sort of fall into that science as well. So I mean, even things as simple as like rhyming myself. So I talk about kids. I talked about my son and how I try to, the terminology we use is prime him for what's to come. Because change is difficult for me as well. So even things as simple as making sure that I am writing down my schedule and taking I tend to my brain is always going. I don't know if that's how it is for you, but there's always something going in my
It
brain.
used to be, um,
Yeah.
but I learned some things that helped that significantly. But I'm curious how what this is like for
Oh.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just have a busy brain, and so I was gonna say taking taking some of that from here and translating it to a piece of paper, a schedule to kind of be able to visually look at has helped a lot. And then um another thing I think I recently talked about on TikTok too is a technique for I experience a lot of rejection sensitive dysphoria. Um, so that's something that has recently been getting to me. Uh, and I use something called cognitive diffusion to sort of separate myself from some of the thoughts that I'm having that I sort of almost I start identifying with. And it really like it's like when you experience a rejection or a perceived rejection, it's like that's all there is. Like it's hard to separate from that thought. So there's something called cognitive diffusion where it's just stepping back from that thought and looking at it more objectively. So rather than like, oh, I'm so stupid because of this thing that I did. It's sort of
Right.
looking at it as an object. Like, this is a thought that I'm having. It means absolutely nothing. And changing the language to like, oh, I'm noticing. I'm noticing what's going on in my head. I'm noticing that I'm having this thought rather than sort of identifying with it, if that makes sense. But there are a lot of different ways that you can sort of practice stuff like that. I think those two are some of the things that I've been working on recently.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for me, for a long time, I would spiral really badly, right? I'm getting up early in the morning. My executive function isn't fully there yet. I'm trying to make coffee, but I'm putting whole beans in the filter, and I'm like, oh, I forgot to grind them. And then
Mhm.
you missed one little step, right? And I caught myself. I didn't pour hot water on the beans. But from there, I'm like, this coffee machine is garbage. I am garbage. Life is garbage. Everything is garbage, right? And suddenly I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
wait, that was not like, I forgot a step in the coffee making process. That doesn't mean
Mhm.
life is garbage. But I feel like that escalation,
Mhm.
or for me, if I get a little bit more personal, oh, why can't I human better? Right?
That's
That
so
thought of like,
relatable.
oh, right? But it's like, and I feel like especially if you're a high masking person, like, I don't feel like the sense I have that a lot of the stuff that comes easy to other people doesn't come easy to me. And
Mhm.
so I'm having to kind of run brute processor power to do the things. And when I do it
Yeah.
wrong, I'm like, oh, why am I not good enough? I'm the worst, blah, 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 right? And then you kind of spiral down. And I've done a lot of work on just acceptance. Hey, I'm human. I get to make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. And
Uh-huh.
I have places where I don't make mistakes. So, but I never noticed that because the mistakes don't happen kind of thing. But finding kindness
Mhm.
and finding self-compassion and God forbid, even finding some self-love in the middle of all that is fucking hard. But it's also like, sometimes I'm noticing it. It's like, oh, like the other day I was hand washing a glass, like a stemware wine glass, and I was too clumsy and I broke it and I cut myself. And I was like, no, actually, it's stemware. It's very fragile. This
Yeah.
happens. I know first aid. I can fix this. And it was only the briefest stuff like, but then I was like, huh, 6 months ago, I
Yeah.
would have spiraled into, I am garbage. Why can't I even wash a glass without blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. It's really easy to identify with like mistakes, even if they're so small and minute. So yeah,
Right.
definitely.
But I'm really impressed by you. Like right before we started recording this, we had some technical difficulties. And then once they were resolved, we sat down and we started and everything was fine. I know if I would have been in your chair, I would have been able to do this interview. I would have been beating myself up really bad for not figuring out the tech. And so I'm noticing in you that you're able to let it go. It's like, oh, this happens. It's fine. We're using weird technology. It's okay. And I'm really impressed by that, right? So somewhere in there, you learned how to, I don't know, was that what happened for you? Or are you sitting here kicking yourself about that still?
Sweating a little bit, trying to figure it out. but um, but yeah, I learning to let things go. It's tough, but
Right.
yeah,
What's the whole don't sweat the small stuff and it's all small stuff, right? If you kind of get to that, like, yeah, in the grand scheme of things, this doesn't matter.
exactly. Yeah.
S-
Mhm.
Do you have
Yeah.
any tips? Like, how do you detach yourself from like what if you're noticing a spiral?
Oh my. I think for me what I'm working on is just I guess stepping back and taking a break and stopping some of those ruminations because I will just loop over and over. Um so I think for me what has helped honestly even just having like knowing what's going on in my brain because I've learned a lot about being neurodivergent has helped me to just be more aware. I think the awareness has helped because, like I said before, I would sort of identify with and mesh with my thoughts. And now I think just being able to stop and see, hey, I'm reacting very strongly to this. Um, hey, I'm perseverating over this and looping over and over, helps me to sort of take a step back. But it doesn't happen all the time. I still struggle with it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. So I'm curious, is there like, wearing an ABA hat, are there behaviors you have yourself that you're like, hey, I would like to unlearn this or change this?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Um I think it's definitely trickier to practice like what I preach on myself, I feel like. Um so yeah. But I have
Well, anything
I
that's there now are pretty deep neural pathways, so that makes sense, right? But
That is true. Yeah. That's
yeah,
also why it's so important to, like we always emphasize early intervention because the brain is just so plastic at that young age. And so it's just a little bit easier to change. But I mean, we can always change our brains and our neural pathways, like you said. But yeah, that's a good point. Um, I think one of the things that I've used quite often that you've probably used too, like a lot of people do and just don't even realize that there's a term, is something that I call it's known as behavioral momentum. So just that idea of doing the hard things or breaking up tasks into smaller pieces to sort of get going. Um rather than looking at the big picture. So, and then that in combination with doing some of the harder things first. So I know that I need downtime, um, to sort of recharge, but I will sort of, because my executive function also sucks, I will, give myself a task to do before I take my little gaming break, my little reading break, whatever it is. And it sort of gets me going. Um, and then a lot of times I just have more momentum to continue getting more things done. Or say I want to clean the kitchen, rather than just giving myself this big daunting task, saying, okay, well, I'm just gonna clean this one counter. Starting there, and then it builds momentum and you're able to get a little bit more done. And then in having access to that break.
yeah,
Uh
totally. I have
yeah.
one friend who always says, "Oh, like all I'm going to do is clean one plate. Like
Hmm.
I'm just going to clean one plate. Like there's
Yeah.
15 plates in the sink, but I'm going to clean one." And then when he's done one, he's like, "Well, fuck it. My hands are wet. I don't like this,
Yeah.
but I may as well do the other 15." But it's just like his mind trick is to say, "I'm going to clean one," and then 15
Yeah.
happen, right? And I think there's a lot
Exactly.
of really interesting like mind tricks you can play with yourself in that general direction. On
Hmm.
the topic of neuroplasticity and kind of retraining yourself, um, there's this coach I work with who really talks quite a lot about radical discontinuity. And what he means by that is do everything different. If you normally brush with your left hand, brush with your right. If you normally drink your coffee with your left hand, drink it with your right. If you normally drink coffee, drink tea. If you walk to work one way, walk another way. And by really just scrambling your brain into having to figure lots of new things out, it means it
Hmm.
becomes much easier to retrain all behaviors. And I was like, I like my patterns. I like my whatever. I don't want to use a different toothpaste or a different toothbrush. But once you get used to that discomfort of something being new with small things that you control, you can choose to
Yeah.
brush with the other hand, right? Suddenly like all these other things just becomes possible. And it is wild what kind of things you can trick your brain into. And I don't know if this classifies as ABA or just random mental jujitsu, but it works for me, and I'm impressed by like how often it works for other people.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Just kind of training yourself to be a little bit more flexible. And then I especially like what you said about like, these are things that you can control. And you can choose, what you want to switch up. So it makes it a little bit less daunting. I really like that. Yeah.
So how do you like? You mentioned you have like a little rest break or a little gaming break. Do you gamify your life in some way to kind of help function?
Um, could say that. I I think that I've just learned how important um my my own self-care is in the past few years. I don't know if you consider yourself a spoonie. You do know about
Yeah.
the spoon theory?
So you just mentioned spoon theory. Can you explain what that is and how that applies to you?
Yeah, so this is something that I only learned about through the autistic community on social media. But it's just this idea that you have sort of a set number of spoons, which represents like, would you say, mental energy or mental or physical sort of energy or bandwidth. Um, and that the tasks that you do throughout the day can sort of take away those spoons. So maybe going to a social event is depleting me of of spoons of energy, and I need to do this specific thing to recharge to get spoons back.
That was like the level 1 approach I had to it. And then the level 2 approach was like, oh, this the amount of spoons I have is variable and the cost of something is variable. Like going
Yeah.
to any restaurant might be, I don't know, 3 spoons. Going to a loud restaurant might be 5. Going to a loud restaurant with food that I'm not used to might be 10 spoons. Going with somebody I don't really like spending time with is infinite spoons, right? But it's like and so that helps you actually plan. So if I'm going on a
Yeah.
date with my girlfriend, I might say, "Hey, could we go somewhere quiet today? I know we have this reservation, but," or like, "Oh, I know we're going out tonight. I suspect it's going to be loud." And she is
Mhm.
very good at like being an ally for me. She is wonderful and is a raging extrovert, right? So she will stand there
Oh,
and talk for
wow.
hours with anybody. And
Yeah.
I was kind of on my way out the door, and then I ran into somebody I really like, and I was like, "Oh!" And so we walked back inside, had another drink. I said, "Oh, but it's loud here." And she noticed me kind of, I don't know what she noticed, to be honest, or she just noticed me. But she kind of rounded up our whole group of friends. It was like, "Hey, let's go upstairs." And it was quieter. There
Oh.
weren't as many people around. And I was like, I felt so loved in that moment because this person just went, "Oh, I would like Haje to be able to stay longer, but something needs to
Mhm.
change because being in like," I was like, "I'm not nearly cool enough for this place." It's like one of the coolest cocktail bars in San Francisco. It's like, it's loud. There's too many young people here. I don't know. This is not my scene at all, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's awesome, but then there are those days where it's like, especially if, say, I've gone out and uh met up with a friend who has other kids and like we socialized and it's all crazy and loud, and then I come home and I just can handle a little bit less. So there are those days where it's like, ooh, I wish I could control my environment a little bit more. But
What do you do in those days?
um well, I I've learned to accommodate better for myself. So one thing I've gotten better at doing is using like noise canceling headphones or have the flare. Some people use those other types of noise dampening tools. Um and then just also regulating with my children, you know, taking some time to do something chill and like, hey, let's sit and color and just sort of tone it down and relax together. I feel like that has helped me to just be able to enjoy them and regulate at the same time,
What do you do when you're home, you're in spoon bankruptcy, and like you just don't have it anymore? Is there like an emergency ripcord?
Yeah, I mean, there are times um, where it's just a lot. And I think it's mostly to do with just my sensitivities, if I'm spending a weekend away and then I come home, that's gonna be a harder day for me than it is if I'm, like, just on my normal routine. So, I don't know if when I get to a certain point, there are times where I will sort of melt down and, um, it's difficult to get control back, and sometimes I just have to go through it, um, and release those emotions, and then I feel a lot better. Stimming has also helped me too, just moving my body in ways that feels good, to sort of release some of that pent up. It feels like just energy that I have to get out of my body sometimes. When it's too much for me, sensory overload is how sort of feels that way.
Yeah, like get the wiggles out.
hmm
What does a meltdown look like for you?
A lot, a lot of crying. So I'm one of those people that will cry, when they're sad, when they're angry, when they're happy. For whatever reason, I've always been that way, and I'm like, I'm just a very emotional person. And then I get into a state like if it's too much, where it's almost like I'm shutting down. I'm kind of going within myself. Um, and yeah, yeah, it's difficult to describe because I think it's more of a internal thing, and I think I also have a little bit of the alexithymia, but
Yeah, no, I hear you.
it just
And but I
yeah.
mean, you do work with people who, you're trying to shepherd into experiences stuff. Like, what is your recommendation if somebody's like
Mm,
clearly
okay,
losing it?
okay. Um, well, like I said, it's definitely harder to do for myself than it is for I feel like I'm always practicing these things. Like I taught my son to do deep breathing, and to identify one thing that I always suggest for kids and adults is to just be able to label what you're feeling or to try, I guess, to put a label to what you're feeling, which can be hard. Um, but what happens when we're in a state of fight or flight and we're, not regulated, the amygdala part of your brain that's responsible for fight or flight is activating. Um, and actually, just the act of labeling your feelings and being able to sort of put words to it activates your frontal lobe, which is responsible for rationalization and sort of uh, leveling you out. So I think that has helped, and I've seen that help a lot of the kids that I've worked with. Just being able to instead of going into this intense meltdown, say okay, this is what I'm feeling right now, and I do notice them sort of come back a little bit, step back, and then just teaching those other coping skills, rep- essentially replacement behaviors um some of the harmful things that you see. Like sometimes
Yeah.
during meltdowns, kids will hurt themselves, or hurt other people. So just teaching coping skills as replacements, like the deep breaths or counting or um, you know, squeezing a pillow instead of aggressing, things like that.
So I've never asked anybody this, but you're a scientist, you're in this space. I can ask you. Is there something inherently bad about meltdowns?
Hmm. Oh, that's an interesting question. I I feel like this is completely just my opinion because I've never really been asked that. It's interesting. I would say no, besides, sometimes it can come with those harmful, self-injury, things that are harmful are obviously not good. The meltdown in and of itself, I would say I almost would view it as a sign that this person's having a lot of trouble regulating and they need tools to be able to navigate through this next time, maybe before it reaches that point. Because I mean, having a meltdown is not pleasant. So it's not pleasant,
Right.
but sometimes it's, I guess, necessary to get that energy out and to get through it. Um,
I definitely notice in myself that if I'm like, there's a tipping point, and when I'm beyond that tipping point, I know, okay, a meltdown is coming in the next, I don't know, hour, day, whatever. It's like it's been
yeah,
too much for too long, and then I'm always like, I'm going to plan it. I'm going to plan to be in my bed where it's nice and safe, and I have like a really nice soft headboard, and my bed is giant and only has pillows on it. Laptop goes on the floor, and then I just put on some music that I know puts me over the edge, and I just let myself have it, and it feels
yeah,
incredibly vulnerable. And sometimes I do hurt myself. Like sometimes I do flail and hit my arm into my bedside table, or sometimes I cry so hard that my stomach hurts or whatever, right? But in the grand scheme of things, I'm like, I'm not going to hospitalize myself. And at the
yeah,
end, I just feel like that was the safety valve. I am, I'm okay again.
yeah,
And I don't know if that's like, I've never actually told anybody this, but I'm like, I feel like sometimes if it goes too far down the thing, it's just a safety valve. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to use my safety valve.
yeah. Do you feel like intense, like after you have a meltdown, do you tend to feel like amazing? Like amazing the
Yeah,
next day? Because that's how I experience it. Like it's a
yeah,
horrible
totally.
feeling in the moment, but then like the next day, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so zen. I was able to get this release.
Yeah,
So
and the wild
I
thing is, so I hate the smell of lavender because, like, after a meltdown, like as soon as I'm kind of settling back down, I can smell lavender in the air, and it's weird. I know there's no lavender. It's just my mind
oh
playing tricks on me. But it's it's either lavender or a very specific type of Indonesian food. Those are the two things I sometimes smell after
whoa
a meltdown, and I'm like, okay, that's happening. But so when I smell lavender out in the world, which is unfortunately a very common fragrance,
yeah.
I'm like, oh, get it away from me. Because
Oh my
I have this
goodness,
very strong
yeah.
association with having just been through something really emotionally traumatic. And it's really fascinating.
Yeah, that is interesting. Wow.
Brains, you know.
Yeah,
But
I love
I'm
it.
intrigued to hear you say though that the day after or soon after a meltdown, what do you feel? How would you describe it?
Ah, I just feel very relaxed and quiet in my brain. My brain feels quieter. Um the way that you were describing how you experience meltdowns and the time before, like you can kind of predict it. Exactly the same for me. Um so I've done the same thing. I've kind of like planned on very relatable. Planned on letting this happen, and then the next day, yeah, I do feel very just relaxed and, like, light and, uh, like, able to think better. It's refreshing. So that's why when you asked me the question about, like, are meltdowns inherently bad? From my experience, it's like, yeah, I mean, I see it as a sign that, like, something has triggered me in my environment, but then when it happens, it's also, in a sense, healing for me? Renewing? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because I feel like I've never had this conversation with anybody before. And I've never read about somebody like planning to have a meltdown, but here we are, two of us, sample size of two, but still, that feels real. And as you say, as long as there's no real harm of like doing lasting damage, like have a
Yeah.
bottle of water nearby. But other than that, I don't know. I want to do some more research on this. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting.
I promised I would take an hour of your time, and we've been recording for exactly an hour. So um, I would love to wrap up with a couple of questions that I ask everybody, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you wish neurotypical people knew about autism?
I thought about this a little bit, and I think the answer for me is honestly just knowing about it in general, like, and wishing to know more and understand us better. Because I do feel like autism is so wildly misunderstood. And we're still learning about it, so I mean fair, but the different presentations and just also recognizing some of the strengths that come with being neurodivergent. So, the detail, the creativity, the way that we feel so deeply, which can be difficult but can also be beautiful. So I think
Yeah.
I wish just people would know more.
Thank you for sharing that. And can you tell me of a time that you were really deeply seen and loved exactly the right way for you?
Yeah. I think over and over again, I would say just being like with my partner, my husband, um, makes me feel that way. Uh, because he just knows the ins and outs of me and accepts my deep emotions since the very beginning. And the times when it's all too much for me. Um, I just feel like what stands out about like the way that he has accepted me, looking back at like past relationships, I feel like there was always a sense of like wanting to change something about me. Like, oh, you're not adventurous enough, you're not spontaneous enough, like social enough, things like that. Uh and my partner just has never tried to change who I am inherently. Um and I just really appreciate that because sometimes it's a lot who I am.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Hmm. Serena, thank you so much for joining me for this chat and for sharing so freely and wonderfully of your experience and your life. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the podcast. You can find us on TikTok on Autistic FM, on Instagram at autistic_FM, or on the web on autistic.fm. On our website, you can also find a link to our newsletter, which I send out whenever we do a new episode, with some additional resources and news from across the world of neurospiciness. The podcast is produced and hosted by me, Haje Kamps. If you know somebody who'd be a great guest for the podcast, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can email us on hello@autistic.fm or reach us on the socials. See you very soon.